Have you ever wondered what happens when someone discovers something that institutions simply cannot acknowledge? Not because the discovery is inherently false, or because it is the product of a deranged mind, but because it is structurally inconvenient. I want to tell you about a naval expedition that took place in the early weeks of 1838. You will find portions of this journey in standard history books, celebrated as a triumph of American maritime navigation and scientific coming of age. But what the crew actually documented in the deep southern latitudes was systematically removed from the historical record. The commander was Lieutenant Charles Wilkes. The destination was the uncharted, freezing perimeter of Antarctica. What he found there, and what occurred when he attempted to report it to the Department of the Navy, tells you everything you need to know about how institutions manage uncomfortable realities. We are taught from our earliest days in school that history is a faithful ledger of facts, preserved by dutiful record keepers for the benefit of future generations. We are rarely taught that history is also a ledger of omissions, carefully curated by institutions protecting their own authority. Charles Wilkes did not set out to challenge the scientific consensus of his era. He was a man of the establishment, a meticulously trained surveyor whose logbooks were masterclasses in maritime precision. But when his instruments recorded the impossible, and his men witnessed a geography that defied the known laws of climate, the institutional response was to classify rather than investigate. To understand the immense weight of what was suppressed, we must first understand the man who reported it and the world he operated within. In 1838, Lieutenant Charles Wilkes was 40 years old, an officer who had survived 18 years of rigorous, unforgiving service in the United States Navy. He was not a man given to flights of fancy, romantic embellishment, or the tall tales typical of 19th century sailors. He was, by all documented accounts, a rigid, exacting disciplinarian with a mind built for mathematics and observation. His expertise lay in hydrography, geodesy, and magnetic surveying. He had spent years calibrating chronometers and maintaining the Navy's charts. When the United States Congress finally authorized the United States Exploring Expedition, the first sovereign scientific enterprise of its kind for the young nation, they needed a commander whose credibility was absolutely unimpeachable. The geopolitical stakes of this voyage were immense. European powers, particularly Great Britain and France, had long dominated the seas, charting coastlines, claiming territories, and establishing themselves as the absolute arbiters of scientific truth. The American government, feeling the sting of being viewed as a cultural and scientific backwater, required an expedition that would prove to London and Paris that the United States Navy possessed equal, if not superior, scientific and navigational prowess. The expedition was not merely a journey of discovery, it was an assertion of national validity. Naval records confirm that Wilkes departed with a squadron of 6 vessels, charged with mapping the vast, unknown expanses of the Pacific and the turbulent, ice-choked Southern Ocean. The published expedition reports, available to anyone who wishes to request them in major naval archives today, detail a grueling but ultimately successful voyage. They show that Wilkes navigated his ships along the icy perimeter of the southernmost continent, charting a massive stretch of forbidding coastline that is still known today as Wilkes Land. The official narrative credits him with proving, definitively, that Antarctica was a massive continent rather than a mere collection of transient ice fields floating at the bottom of the globe. His documented astronomical observations were accurate to the minute. His coastal measurements have been verified by subsequent modern expeditions using satellite technology. Wilkes did exactly what he was commissioned to do, with a level of accuracy that should have secured his place in the pantheon of great explorers. Yet, when we examine the institutional archives from the months immediately following his return to the United States, a profound and deeply troubling dissonance emerges. The official, published version of Wilkes's expedition report contains exactly 76 pages concerning the Antarctic leg of the journey. It is a dry, technical read, filled with coordinates, wind speeds, and descriptions of pack ice. However, the Navy Department's own submission logs from March of 1838 record the official receipt of a manuscript totaling 289 pages. 213 pages of navigational data, meteorological observations, and crew testimonies were meticulously excised before the public was allowed to see the document. This is not speculation. It is a documented institutional gap, sitting in plain sight for anyone who knows where to look. The table of contents from the original draft, which somehow survived the purges, references a specific section titled Geographic Anomalies Requiring Further Investigation. That section does not appear in any surviving official copy of the manuscript. Furthermore, upon his triumphant return, despite having achieved the exact monumental goals set before him by an anxious Congress, Charles Wilkes was subjected to a highly publicized, career-destroying court-martial. The charges officially centered on nebulous accusations of conduct unbecoming an officer, But the transcripts of the proceedings reveal that the prosecution relentlessly focused on the false reporting of geographic features. The man handpicked for his legendary precision, the man who had calibrated the Navy's own instruments, was being systematically discredited for what he claimed to have precisely measured. The expedition's descent into the uncharted waters near 66 degrees south latitude began in the freezing, disorienting atmospheric haze of January 1838. According to the sanitized published accounts, the squadron encountered heavy pack ice, forcing them to sail parallel to a massive, unbroken frozen barrier for weeks on end. But the private correspondence, the intercepted letters, and the surviving journal fragments of the men aboard tell a vastly different, deeply unsettling story. In a letter to his brother, preserved for generations in a private family archive in New England, one of the expedition's primary navigators described the sudden, inexplicable failure of their magnetic instruments. The compasses did not simply drift, as one might expect near the magnetic pole. They spun wildly or locked onto invisible coordinates that shifted by the hour, creating navigational dead zones. These were not minor deviations that could be corrected with a simple calculation. They were massive magnetic anomalies that rendered standard maritime navigation virtually impossible, forcing the crew to rely entirely on visual sightings in a landscape dominated by blinding whiteouts and freezing fog. The institutional gap becomes a veritable chasm when we examine what happened next. According to 23 separate sworn statements taken from crew members immediately upon their return, statements that were swiftly classified by the Navy Department and only discovered in fragmented, heavily redacted form decades later, the expedition did not just see a wall of ice. As they navigated through a treacherous, grinding break in the ice floes, multiple independent accounts report that the frozen shelf gave way to a rocky, dark coastline. The visual anomaly was accompanied by a terrifying thermal impossibility. The ship's naturalist, tasked with recording environmental data and collecting specimens, documented sudden surges of warm air currents blowing outward from the interior region. According to his private journal, which was later discovered misfiled in a completely unrelated naval registry, the temperature readings spiked dramatically as they approached this break in the ice. This suggested a massive geothermal heat source, or an unexplained thermal anomaly, in a region where the ambient air temperature should have been lethal to exposed skin. The men reported seeing vegetation. Not merely microscopic algae, but lichen and thick moss clinging to exposed, steaming rock formations that extended deep inland, disappearing into a hazy horizon. Even more disturbing to the crew were the atmospheric phenomena of unknown origin that accompanied this geographic impossibility. Multiple testimonies describe vivid, pulsating green lights emanating directly from the landmass itself. They behaved somewhat like auroras, but they occurred during daylight hours, cutting through the fog, and were localized entirely over the anomalous, temperate coastline rather than dancing high in the upper atmosphere. The expedition's chief cartographer, a man dedicated to the exact representation of physical reality, dutifully mapped this feature. We know this with certainty because classified correspondence between the cartographer and the Navy Department shows him violently protesting a direct order to redraw his charts. In 1839, he abruptly resigned his commission, walking away from his pension and his livelihood, rather than attach his respected name to a revised, sanitized map where the rocky, temperate coastline had been completely erased and replaced with the innocuous words, ice barrier. But the institutional suppression extended far beyond the quiet alteration of cartography. It cost human lives. The official naval logbooks record that 3 crew members died by drowning during the Antarctic maneuver. It is presented as a sterile, tragic maritime statistic, the inevitable cost of doing business at the bottom of the world. However, fragments of Wilkes's own confiscated personal diaries, retained in secret by his nephew after the Navy raided his personal estate, describe a far more unsettling sequence of events. Having documented the warm air currents, the failing compasses, and the impossible geography, Wilkes, driven by his mandate to explore, ordered a small boat deployed to take physical samples of the shoreline and measure the temperature of the water near the rocks. 3 men volunteered to navigate the treacherous break in the ice. According to Wilkes's private, frantic account, as the men approached the anomalous coastline, they simply ceased to respond to flag signals. The atmospheric distortion thickened around them. The water near the coastline churned with violent thermal activity, and the boat vanished into the luminous green haze. They did not drown in a sudden storm. They disappeared in calm, warm waters while investigating a geographic impossibility that the scientific consensus dictated could not exist. When the squadron finally returned to the United States, bruised, battered, and carrying a terrifying secret, the institutional response was swift, synchronized, and devastating. The crew members who had submitted the 23 sworn statements regarding the temperate landmass were immediately isolated. They were systematically reassigned to separate, incredibly distant postings. Some were sent to the Mediterranean fleet. Others were dispatched to the farthest reaches of the Pacific Squadron. This deliberate, calculated dispersal ensured they could never congregate, never compare notes, and never corroborate their stories to the burgeoning American press. The families of the 3 deceased men were quietly issued standard Navy pensions, visited by ranking officers, and firmly told not to ask further questions about the exact nature of the drownings for the sake of national security. And then came the absolute destruction of Charles Wilkes. To acknowledge his full report would mean validating a geographical absurdity that the esteemed European scientific societies would relentlessly mock. It would paint the United States Navy not as peerless explorers, but as superstitious fools chasing mirages, thereby destroying the very international credibility the expedition was designed to establish. Furthermore, acknowledging a warm, habitable zone in the Antarctic would trigger a geopolitical crisis, as every nation with a navy would immediately rush to claim it. It was far more efficient, far more rational from an institutional perspective, to destroy the man rather than rewrite the laws of science and diplomacy. The court-martial was meticulously designed to paint Wilkes as an abusive, erratic, and highly unstable commander prone to hallucination under pressure. His personal journals, the only unfiltered record of the thermal anomaly in the lost men, were confiscated as evidence during the trial and never returned to his family, vanishing into the vaults of the Navy Department. When examining a historical rupture of this magnitude, we must rigorously separate what is documented fact from what is witness testimony, and what remains a permanent institutional secret. Here is what we can absolutely verify through primary sources. Lieutenant Charles Wilkes submitted a 289-page report that was aggressively, almost surgically redacted down to 76 pages. The Navy Department actively classified the sworn testimonies of 23 separate crewmen regarding their Antarctic observations. A highly skilled, respected cartographer resigned his commission and ended his career rather than alter his physical charts to match an official narrative. 3 men died under circumstances that required the immediate sealing of all related naval correspondence for half a century. And the commander of the most important expedition in American history was subjected to a career-destroying court-martial, specifically targeting his geographical reporting. These are not conspiracy theories whispered in dark corners. These are documented, verifiable institutional behaviors. Here is what we have as consistent, cross-verified witness testimony extracted from the men before they were silenced. 23 individuals, separated and interrogated individually without the chance to collude, described a warm, rocky coastline where modern science dictates only miles of ancient ice should exist. They described localized atmospheric lighting, severe electromagnetic interference that disabled their instruments, and the distinct smell of exposed earth and vegetation. The ship's naturalist, an expert in his field, documented a thermal anomaly so severe it threatened to crack their glass instruments. What we cannot verify is the true nature of the phenomena they observed, precisely because the institutions in power actively, intentionally prevented any subsequent investigation. We must recognize that the suppression was not born of cinematic malice or some shadow cabal. It was born of incredibly rational institutional incentives. In 1838, the United States Congress was funding scientific exploration to build national prestige. Acknowledgement of a temperate oasis, complete with anomalous lights and magnetic dead zones in the Antarctic, would have invited devastating ridicule from the established scientific societies of London and Paris. It would have jeopardized all future funding for American naval exploration, effectively ending the Navy's scientific ambitions. The existing scientific paradigm simply could not integrate the observation. Therefore, institutional inertia favored suppression over integration. It is always easier to silence 30 men than to rewrite the foundational texts of global geography. Were the men aboard the squadron suffering from a collective psychological event? A mass hallucination brought on by the extreme isolation, scurvy, and the profound environmental stress of the Southern Ocean? Were they witnessing a rare, entirely natural phenomenon? Perhaps an unprecedented atmospheric refraction that created a vivid, hyper-realistic mirage of land, combined with a temporary violent geothermal vent that warmed the local waters? Or did they stumble upon a genuine geographic anomaly of unknown origin? An isolated ecosystem shielded by intense thermal activity that the Navy immediately recognized as strategically vital and instantly classified? The tragedy of this history is that we cannot subject these competing theories to the rigorous scientific method, because the scientific consensus hasn't examined the original data. The data was deliberately erased from the ledger of human knowledge. Charles Wilkes spent the remainder of his long, frustrating life attempting to vindicate his name. He continued to serve in the Navy during the Civil War, but the shadow of the Antarctic court-martial never left him. The institutional doors of the scientific community, the very people he had sought to elevate, were permanently closed to him. He was a pariah, a man who knew too much about a place that didn't officially exist. He died in 1877, a bitter and thoroughly discredited man. According to a heartbreaking family history recorded in the early 20th century, His final statement to his nephew regarding the Antarctic voyage was simple, profound, and devastating. I reported what I saw. They destroyed me for telling the truth. What does it mean when a powerful institution chooses silence over investigation? What does it mean when the machinery of government decides that reality itself is too inconvenient to acknowledge? It means that our understanding of the world, our very map of reality, is shaped not merely by what physically exists, but by what those in power can afford to acknowledge. The story of the Wilkes expedition is not just a maritime mystery buried under 2 centuries of ice. It is an enduring, terrifying lesson in the mechanics of historical narrative. We are taught to trust the official record, to believe that science and history march forward hand in hand in a continuous, unbroken line of progressive discovery. But cases like the Wilkes anomaly reveal the deep, jagged fractures in that timeline. They show us that when highly credible witnesses observe phenomena that destabilize existing academic or political frameworks, they are systematically marginalized, their careers destroyed, and their evidence buried. We see this pattern repeating across centuries in various disciplines and across different nations. It is the exact same coordinated institutional response that meets any fundamentally disruptive observation. The suppression is rarely a secret society whispering in smoke-filled rooms. It is much more mundane and much more terrifying. It is the bureaucratic machinery of grant committees, peer review boards, and departmental credibility. It is the cartographer forced to erase his life's work to keep his family fed. It is the sailor reassigned to a distant port so he cannot speak to a journalist. It is the steady, quiet suffocation of human curiosity. Yet, the truth has a strange, persistent habit of outliving the institutions that try to bury it. In the 1950s, during the International Geophysical Year, when nations finally returned to Antarctica in earnest, declassified naval documents briefly surfaced, referencing a Wilkes geographic anomaly requiring ongoing classification. The mention was quickly buried again, dismissed as an archiving error. More recently, independent researchers working outside the restrictive funding parameters of major universities, examining modern satellite thermal imaging, have noted unexplained, highly localized heat signatures in the precise coordinates of Wilkes Land, where the expedition reported their impossible coastline. The technology to investigate these anomalies exists today. We have ground-penetrating radar, deep ice core sampling capabilities, and advanced thermal mapping satellites that can read the temperature of a single rock from low Earth orbit. The question is not whether we could investigate the Wilkes anomaly. The question is whether institutional structures will ever fund research outside their own established paradigms. I cannot tell you definitively what Charles Wilkes and his men found in the freezing, luminous fog of 1838. I cannot tell you what happened to the 3 men who vanished into that thermal anomaly, leaving behind only frantic flag signals and classified files. But I can tell you that the coordinated, ruthless erasure of their testimony is, in itself, evidence of something profound. It is evidence that institutional power operates by controlling the perimeter of human inquiry. It controls not just the answers we are allowed to find, but the questions we are allowed to ask. As we reflect on this suppressed chapter of our history, I ask you to consider how many other pages have been quietly, expertly removed from the archives of human discovery. How many other anomalies have been reclassified as weather balloons, mirages, or the delusions of tired men? What do you do with a history that has been curated for your comfort rather than your understanding? The past is not a solid foundation. It is a battleground of narratives. Keep questioning the omissions. Keep looking at the gaps in the records, for it is in the silences of our institutions that the most profound truths are often hidden. Stay curious, question the consensus, and remember, the most absolute, the most terrifying form of censorship is not burning a book in the public square. It is ensuring that the research is never funded, the data is never published, and the anomaly is never investigated in the very first place.